to go? Okay. All right, guys, ready? All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to get started here. My name's Mike Moore. I'm with Mach7 Technologies. You have to have a headset on, sir. Yeah. That's the trick. Yeah, sorry about that. All right, so I'm Mike Moore with Mach7. We're going to start this afternoon's session. You do need to have a headset on, and otherwise you won't hear us, so that would be good. Today we're talking about the evolution of enterprise imaging, specifically the move beyond what we're calling the monolith. By monolith, we mean the traditional model where a single centralized imaging system is expected to manage, orchestrate, and deliver every imaging workflow across the enterprise. What many organizations are discovering is that the traditional one system that does everything approach doesn't really scale, and it's harder to optimize for every different clinical workflow. So today we're going to explore what's driving the shift, why pathology is accelerating it, and what a more modular, interoperable enterprise imaging strategy looks like moving forward. So let's introduce our panel for today. Dr. Marc Kohli is a professor of radiology and biomedical imaging at UCSF, medical director of imaging informatics for UCSF Health, an associate chair of clinical informatics. He's deeply involved in enterprise imaging operations, imaging IT, and clinical informatics leadership. Mike Valante is an industry subject matter expert and SIIM Enterprise Imaging Committee member. Mike has spent more than 2 decades focused on enterprise imaging, pathology, PACS, and imaging informatics strategy. Andrew Volkening is vice president of product at Mach7 Technologies and also serves on the SIIM Education Committee. Andrew brings deep operational and technical experience from both PACS administration and enterprise imaging and product strategy. And finally, Barinder Dhillon is a product manager at Mach7 with a unique background spanning clinical imaging, imaging informatics, and enterprise workflow design. His experience bridges frontline clinical operations and enterprise imaging strategy. Dr. Kohli, let's go ahead and start with you as our first question. From your perspective, where do the traditional enterprise imaging systems begin to break down in real clinical or operational workflows?
Thanks. So I think that one of the big challenges is that the workflows that we have are really idiosyncratic in the different clinical areas. So the needs for a cardiologist, where they do a lot of, say, integrated reporting along with their viewing, are very different from how radiology is deployed, are very different from how pathology is deployed. The workflows are different, the case volumes are different, and having a single solution that essentially tries to force all of those into a lowest common denominator is something that's not going to be palatable and acceptable. And then in addition to that, we're seeing shortages for all of the physicians across these image-producing specialties that are leading to increasing volumes that people are expected to interpret. I think my volume, I've probably increased at least 1.5 times to 2 times what I was reading previously, just to try to keep up with the shortages. And that really requires much more specialized tooling, because if you don't have that, you can't be efficient.
So Andrew, from the challenges that Dr. Kohli brings up, are these happening from a systems and architecture standpoint, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, I think it's both from a systems and architecture standpoint as well as workflow operations, right? As Dr. Kohli pointed out, you have all these different departments that have completely different workflows and sometimes even completely different terminology. So you have that component, as well as you have architecture that is traditionally not designed to scale to the size that institutions are creating imaging these days. When you look at the amount of imaging being produced, it way outpaces the size and amount of images that are being produced way outpaces just the small raise in the number of cases that are being produced. So having an infrastructure that can be flexible, that can grow, that can handle all of that demand in these modern workflows isn't something that a lot of traditional systems were designed to satisfy.
So Mike, are we seeing this just in certain segments of the industry, or is this something that you're seeing cross-industry, across IDNs, academic medical systems, wherever? Is it happening everywhere, or is this isolated because of certain conditions?
Yeah, I would say what we see from a Dell Technologies perspective is that not only is the data growing in kind of 2 different dimensions, the average file size of the traditional type of imaging work that is being undertaken is growing as those image generating devices become more sophisticated and evolve, but also there are just new imaging objects that are arriving on scene that have similar requirements for management, storage, long-term retention, security, protection. At the same time, coinciding with that is an expansion of the consumers of that data. And those consumers often consume data very differently. The research organizations consume that same data very differently than clinicians do. And so the adaptability of the architectures that are required today to effectively support both that scale, that security and performance, and those different user types just requires more sophistication. It's available, it just requires more thought.
And I think that's a really good point about who the end users are. As we continue to grow the digitized imaging footprint of these institutions, a lot of the time people underestimate who their consumers are. They're looking at who their consumers are currently. And when you bring imaging into that enterprise imaging strategy, you're greatly enlarging that radius of consumer from just that one department to patients, to referring physicians, to researchers, for education. So that footprint of who's your consumer isn't something that's static. It's going to grow greatly as you integrate that ology into your enterprise imaging strategy.
So Barinder, when we think about this really at the clinical and also in imaging informatics, how does this show up from the end user and the workflow perspective, some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, from the workflow perspective, the big word is friction. When you have the system that's a poor fit for all these different consumer groups, and even with some of the different producer groups, it creates a lot of little areas of friction throughout the workflow. So like a couple of minutes here because you had to spend an extra bit of time going to a different application, another minute here because you had to deal with an alert that really wasn't useful. They all add up, and it results in a lot of users having to find workarounds to the workflow that the organization wants them to carry out. And these workarounds are usually very poorly documented. In many cases, they involve skipping steps that are maybe important organizationally, like data collection type of steps, but that end users think slow down their workflow. And so you get a lot of these hidden costs that add up, and they're very poorly understood, and they're very hard to then deal with.
If I could add to that, I think that one of the things that's been a challenge for us is really on the infrastructure side of things, and that is that as the consumer base grows, as the size of the data grows, and as our operations grow, we're finding new bottlenecks. And so, historically, radiology put the network into the hospital, right? And now I think radiology and even more pathology is starting to put stress on that network. And a lot more people are competing for the dollars for the infrastructure upgrades. And so it's just really important to make high quality infrastructure decisions that are going to be durable for not just the next 3 years, but really the next 5 to 10 years, and a whole new set of relationships to make that successful.
I think there's a lot of that infrastructure component, but then there's also, when you're talking about having specialized applications in your imaging strategy, you're doing that because those applications can make intelligent decisions on how do I best leverage that infrastructure to get you the data as quickly as possible, to make sure that you have what you need before you need it. Where when you don't have specialized applications that are designed to maximize the infrastructure that you have, you throw money at the problem, right? I need a bigger pipe, I need more horsepower, I need all of this type of stuff because my software isn't optimized. So I think there's always that balancing act of what's the right infrastructure with, do I have an application that can leverage the infrastructure that I have as well?
It seems like we're bringing in kind of pathology is almost theology that kind of breaks some of that, what you're describing, right, Andrew? Because all of a sudden it exposes some of those shortcomings in the architecture just based on the sheer magnitude of the studies that are coming in from a file size, as Mike mentioned, and kind of bringing that. Mike, do you want to talk about kind of where digital pathology starts to expose this?
Yeah, I don't want to blame it on pathology. It's not the pathologist's fault.
In fact, it's a good thing, right? Because we're bringing pathology in to the rest of the imaging environment versus keeping it separate.
But I would agree that ideologically, a lot of image management constructs, reference architecture, such, were kind of based around radiology and radiology workflows. And when you add these other types of image objects, and pathology is certainly one, but so is all the point of care imaging, all the encounter-based stuff, and they have different consumers, and they have different access requirements and retention requirements. But clearly those groups would argue that their information is as clinically important, and the performance, security, scalability demands are equal to whoever came before them. So I think it's really more of a message, if I can do the shout out to the IT teams, which is you need them to understand what you're trying to accomplish from an infrastructure, from an IT perspective or a clinical perspective, so that they can best leverage the technology that they often largely already have, but utilize it in a way that is most effective. And this also comes about in changes in the way the organizations have expanded. There was a period of time when the bigs bought the littles, and now there's no littles, so now the bigs are buying the bigs, and those decisions become really complicated and need thorough thought from a variety of stakeholders, not just the clinical teams, but honestly the underlying support teams that have to deliver the right fabric in which to support those clinical operations.
And as you get into other ologies as well, Marc was talking about there's all kinds of different workflows, but data quality becomes another really important topic, where it's not just about moving the data and some of the different concepts there, but what is an accession number in radiology doesn't exist in pathology, and you have case numbers, and being able to understand, hey, there's different data types, there's different way of identifying different imaging types, and being able to construct that together into one workflow also becomes complicated, because it's not just moving the images, but it's moving the images with enough information that the imaging is useful. And so kind of balancing that, I need to rethink how I move imaging, and hey, now there's this concept of tiles and not just frames and images anymore. So I'm having to be smart about different concepts of imaging, but I'm also having to understand each ology enough that I can build those workflows in that they need to be successful. And knowing, like you said, that a lot of imaging systems are built off of radiology constructs. These are constructs that these other departments just don't understand at all. And so, as opposed to the other departments needing to learn how to work like radiology works, it's important to be able to, as you're building your enterprise imaging strategy, to let the departments work in a way that's conducive to their success with applications that understand how that department wants to work.
So just to build on that for 1 second, I think one of the things that makes me so excited about SIIM is that I was on the board a long time ago. We talked for a very long time about expanding to additional imaging producing specialties, and now we're at a point where we have dermatologists who are on the board, we have cardiologists who are on the board, we have pathologists who are on the board sitting alongside radiologists, and the society is really working to kind of meet those clinicians where they are and bring them into this community, because I think that's been the real value of SIIM, has been the partnership between the industry partners, the infrastructure folks, the applications, and the clinical partners. So there's one thing that was Michael's idea that I'm going to give him credit for, which is that there is now basically they call it a bridge pass, or it's kind of like a ski pass, where you get registration for both the SIIM annual meeting and the Digital Pathology Association meeting for the same reduced price. And so I think that synergy, we're really trying to help people accelerate and kind of get through some of the mistakes of the past. And so I'm just really excited about SIIM and how it's contributing to that.
I think that's a really good point, because you used to see in the past, as enterprise imaging expanded to more departments and more departments and more departments, you used to see a lot of the same mistakes happen again and again and again. You'd have, okay, we've got some deployments in radiology, now we're going to cardiology, and cardiology making the same mistakes that radiology made, because there wasn't that education system to kind of lift everybody up as lessons are learned. And as we're deploying to other ologies, forums like this, where we're having these conversations, is really important to let us be successful as we're building enterprise imaging strategies, and we're learning from the past, and we're not making the mistakes, and we're driving to that future.
Yeah.
So I guess at Barinder, let me bring you back into this. So from a user adoption and kind of workflow design, how do you see some of those differences in kind of the planning? And you talked about alleviating friction, right? That's kind of the intention here. But are there some things that that organizations don't anticipate when they're doing things like integrating pathology or some of the other ologies?
Yeah, I think with pathology especially, one of the big challenges is going to be marrying the specimen-centric thought process and workflow that pathologists have with the patient-centric thought process and workflows that radiology and really the rest of the enterprise has. And I don't think it's fully understood exactly what the ramifications of that is, because pathology being brought into the enterprise is so new. Like even just when you think about the tool set and sort of the way that a pathologist works, it's going to be very, very focused around the experience they had on the microscope and kind of what they need to do there, and being able to navigate between different resolution levels. But that might not be the way that a radiologist needs to deal with pathology data, or an ED doctor, an oncologist, and what have you. And so there is this sort of, open, like wild west right now, where people are going to figure out what does it actually mean to enterprise enable pathology, and how are users going to actually want to interact with these pathology images and the pathology data in a way that fits with their existing workflows and doesn't actually introduce this additional point of friction and makes it maybe not worthwhile for them to realize the benefits of it.
It's walking that tricky line of, you want to fit within existing workflows, but you don't want to recreate an analog workflow with digital tools, because now you're not finding those efficiencies that you're looking for.
No, you'll just magnify the inefficiency if you try to if you try to
exactly.
digitize
So
an
it's
efficient workflow. But I would say it is not about finding a common workflow. That will only try to lead to the least common denominator, which by definition won't be optimal for anybody. I really think it is recognizing a platform that allows different workflows, sharing a common set of data, but sharing it and using it in different ways, because these consumers are all going to want to consume this data somewhat differently. And it is being achieved at many organizations. This is not necessarily a novel concept. It's just not a widely deployed concept at this point. But there are lots of organizations who are doing this quite successfully and continuing to build to scale.
So let me just try to give like a tangible clinical example of one of the things that I think we're talking about here. So if you think about the workflow of most radiology studies, you have a radiologist, a single person who is going to open a case, look at that case, and sign it. And usually that process takes a few minutes. But or a lot of minutes, depending on how complex your studies are. But if you think about the process in pathology, a lot of times you might have multiple people that need to touch that case and look at it before it's going to be signed. They may not actually have all of the information that they need to sign that case when they first look at it. In fact, they might discover something that says, well, I need to get more immunohistochemical stains. And those are things that take a good deal of time. And so having like a concept of a work list that works for radiology, and the idea of, well, we're going to look every 24 hours to make sure that everything that was completed is going to be finalized, is something that is not an assumption that's going to hold true for those pathological workflows. So I think we need to try to uncover like where are our blind spots, where are our assumptions, and the things that made total sense for this ology but don't make any sense for that ology in order to be able to support this.
And that's the approach that we're advocating through this talk, right? Is not taking this monolithic approach and not also taking a lowest common denominator approach, but instead thinking about a more modular enterprise strategy that gives you those foundation layers that are going to support all the variety of studies and images and DICOM and non-DICOM and all the things that are coming in, but then also leaving room in that architecture for the modular needs of those other ologies, right? So that we're giving people a flexible, it anticipates, we would never call anything future-proof at this point in technology, right? But trying to design things in such a way that we anticipate that imaging is only going to continue to grow, both in volume and type and variety, and more different clinicians and scientists and researchers wanting to look at it potentially, depending on your setting, right? So, Andrew, from an architectural point of view, what is the guidance about how to start thinking about modularizing your infrastructure as it relates to this?
Well, it definitely starts with taking a standards-based approach, because I think one of the reasons that people choose a monolithic approach is they're afraid of complexity, and there's a feeling that that complexity exists when I have a lot of systems, and there definitely is overhead to kind of taking that approach, but at the same time, a standards-based architecture lets you put the right tools in at the right time. You're talking about being future-proof. The tool that's right for you today may not be the tool that's right for you 2 years from now. So having a standards-based approach where I am not building a proprietary environment, but I'm building an environment that's built off of integrations that are commonly supported, that exist throughout vendors, and that I am having that information flow without having to be worried about, is everything getting to the right system, is my data stale, that type of thing is very important. At the same time, in your architecture, it's really important to understand, what are my systems of record? What is my source of truth? As I have multiple systems for multiple functions, having, for example, a common source of truth for imaging, where I know that this is my system of record for all imaging, and knowing that that's the source of truth is also really important. But to me, that standards-based approach of building out that enterprise imaging strategy really lets you leverage and grow and be flexible. So yes, maybe every system isn't future-proof, but your architecture is.
So Mike, how do leading organizations balance the trade-offs? Because as Andrew said, from kind of a managing risk point of view, having a single stack or that monolith that we've talked about, there's some safety and security in that. We start to spread things out or use a multi-vendor strategy, there's some risk we're potentially introducing into the operation. So when you look at leading organizations, how are they balancing those risks and those trade-offs?
I think organizations that are doing this really effectively are very clear about the use cases that they're trying to support, so that it is looked at almost from the inside out, and not, well, we have all this data, how are we going to manage this data? It's really from what do we want to do with this data? And then that starts to define a strategy around, well, who uses this data? And then that defines a strategy for what does it take to deliver that data to those sets of users? And then you eventually get to an architecture, and I agree with Andrew about the standards piece, because wherever there may be flat spots within utilizing standards for interoperability, the benefits clearly outweigh that, the shortcuts that you might think you gain. And I think we've certainly been seeing that within the whole slide imaging community, and the adoption of DICOM as the overall interoperability standard for moving pathology images. And look, it's clearly not as mature as what we see in radiology. Of course, we had, decades long head start in radiology to get where it is. So there's a lot of goodness that can be leveraged. It's going to take some additional time to tease out for the pathology workflows, but it's really the right fabric in which to start with. And I'm kind of looking at the audience, and I see some fellow DICOM zealots that are out there who believe this, because if you've lived through it for a while, you really do realize it's easy to maybe take shots at, well, but I would like it to do this, it doesn't do that. And you go, but the list of the things that it provides you significantly longer than the things that you still have to be teased out.
You touched on one thing that I just want to amplify there. I think a lot of people, when they're looking at imaging, the question they're asking is, how do I store this data? And that's the wrong question. The right question is, how do I leverage this data? And really taking that approach as you're building your strategy is super important.
I just want to double down on that again. The thing is that I think that when you talk about the risk and the uncertainty that goes along with creating something that's more bespoke with the configuration complexity, I think that that's actually being a little bit myopic in characterizing it that way, because you're not really taking the complexity out of the system. You're just shifting who has to bear that complexity. And you're shifting that complexity out of the IT space and onto the expensive provider space. And obviously I'm super biased when it comes to this, being an expensive provider, but I think that it's really, really critical to look at that risk holistically across your organization and not just look at the IT silo.
Yeah, I think you can look at it from a variety of silos, including some clinical silos. But I think once we acknowledge that images and imaging more broadly is an enterprise asset, not a series of departmental assets, then you start reframing how you think about how that data should be shared, contextualized, leveraged, to your point, and ultimately managed and stored and protected and secured. And when you do that, you start to really change who needs to sit at that table to figure out how to accelerate and advance and grow adoption, particularly in newer digital transformations.
So let's go back to you, Dr. Kohli, on that point that Mike makes about, I know from speaking with you, you have a very collaborative approach to building, kind of bringing everyone together about this. Do you want to talk about what if you want to implement a strategy like this, it can't happen from one individual group or team within the hospital or the health system. It needs to be much more collaborative. So do you want to talk about your approach there and what you advocate?
Yeah, so I would say that a big secret to my success, maybe it's not a secret to the success at UCSF, is that piece of collaboration. And that is not only clinical collaboration, but that's also collaboration with the people who are working in IT. It's also collaboration with our industry partners, because the reality is that 25 years ago you might be able to do this in a vacuum with a small team, but now things are increasingly interdependent. And so I spend probably 80 to 90% of my effort on people and relationships to keep that collaboration alive and to keep it going and growing. And so, I mean, informatics, we love to, and I'm a technology person as much as anything, but it's really, really important to focus on those relationships to build and nurture them along the way.
It's funny, we have had this whole discussion. We have not said AI yet, which is rare at a radiology conference these days. But I think another characteristic to be thinking about is lots of ways to think of AI as productive tools, but thinking about AI as a consumer of data, because it is a consumer of data. And it really also feeds back into this paradigm of breaking down a monolith, leveraging data effectively, with what turns out to be a tool that delivers either an operational or clinical value or research value, but it in of itself, it has its own needs and characteristics for how it needs to interact with data, just as clinicians do.
Well, I think, Barinder, this is an area I know focus for you about having this modular approach in an enterprise imaging strategy is the use of AI and the role that it can play, because things are changing so rapidly in the world of AI and tools and models that if you make a deep investment in one and then ultimately realize something better is happening right now, maybe you haven't future-proofed yourself enough. But thinking about workflow design and how AI comes into it and kind of advising our customers about how they work with this, what's your take on that and kind of, again, how it relates to this modular approach?
Yeah, so I mean, organizations, they want to be innovative in their own right? And so they want to be able to adopt AI tools, and then they also want to be able to quickly pivot away to new tools as new technology emerges. And so, yes, on the organizational level, the ability to have this complexity is really powerful, and the ability to manage it is really powerful. But then in some ways, you kind of need this abstraction layer for the clinicians, because a lot of clinicians are like, I just want to get through my work. And so if every year we're using a new AI model that integrates into my workflow in a new way, I'm looking for the same information in different areas, that's really not going to be good for them. It's really going to slow them down. So and it's kind of on the vendors, to be honest, to sort of think about things in this way and to design with usability in mind and integration in mind. So, if you have an AI algorithm that's supposed to be affecting how a case is triaged, you don't want to have a new column in your work list that you have to look for and that says, oh, this is like a 93% positive, but then it's a stat case, and then I have to mentally combine those two to come up with your own triage score. You need a solution, like a work list solution ideally, that's able to sort of take all these bits of information that are supposed to go into triaging case and just do that for you. So then you as a clinician, you have just the same experience. And so you kind of need you need your vendors to be able to think about, as Andrew said, open standards that allow things to communicate well, of UX, UI decisions that are made with usability in mind and consistency in mind. And so that way the organization you get the best of both worlds. The organization has the ability to manage complexity, introduce these new and exciting technologies, whereas the clinicians, they're in the best position to make use of them in a way that is still meaningful to them and is consistent for them.
That's great. So I think, Dr. Kohli, going back to you, with what we've talked about, the monolith and kind of the challenges associated with it, breaking things down, developing a more enterprise-wide strategy, and some of the opportunities that exist there, what do you see as some of those roadblocks, challenges that stop people from adopting this? Or if you face those already at UCSF, how did you overcome them? In addition to the collaboration and that approach that you've already talked about.
Oh yeah, so collaboration is hard, so I'll just tell a brief story about that. I'd say that the first piece is that I think that the imaging informatics community and the enterprise imaging community in particular have really been so far out in front of the market and the customers with identifying the value of collaboration, but we're still struggling with trying to help people who are in these additional image producing specialties to understand the need that they have. And so in my personal journey, I can be as kind and as helpful and as thoughtful to the pathologists and friendly as possible. But once our institution said, well, you're going to consolidate all your IT stuff under the same person who happens to be the radiology person, now all of a sudden those pathologists are a whole heck of a lot more interested in collaborating with me. So, and I think as they have now suffered from, we're kind of in our second generation of digital pathology. The first solution was a proprietary-based solution, nothing standards-based about it, and it grew to the point that it went into performance hell. And so now they're coming to us with a need. And that need is we need to find a solution that's going to be performant. Radiology has something that's performant. So it's really just being there and being a constant advocate and kind of ready to meet them when they're ready to participate in it, and showing them that trust and that technical competency ahead of time so that when they're ready, you're there for them.
So Andrew, technically speaking, you have to have some interoperability, both inside the enterprise and kind of outside as well, and kind of working through that in the architectural phase. When we're working with customers and kind of doing that design and bringing the other ologies to the table, as Dr. Kohli is talking about, what are some of the keys you would recommend people think about, kind of principles or kind of standards to address?
Yeah, I mean, from an architectural perspective, obviously you're kind of always going back to what are the problems I'm trying to solve, and starting there, and then making sure that you are doing that in a way that is kind of conducive to everybody's needs, not just the user's needs. We're talking about AI. If I want to train AI data, I want to make sure that my self-training AI data isn't affecting the radiologist's performance. And so kind of going back to that, defining success and looking at what success is for everybody, and then starting to kind of peel back the layers of the onion there. Maybe I need to have a large repository in the cloud because I leverage a lot of AI and I need to be able to maintain that, and I need scalability for that. But at the same time, maybe my cloud performance isn't great, so I'm looking at a hybrid where I'm leveraging the cloud for kind of that on-demand performance, but I'm leveraging on-prem for my actual users. It's looking at what are my success criteria, what are the options, kind of cost-benefit analysis on a lot of things to look at. A lot of times we can dream big, but then kind of having the dollars to implement that architecture may be unrealistic. And so taking that what is ideal state, really understanding your workflows, and then trying to build something that kind of meets all of that success criteria, but doing it doing it as cost effectively as possible, knowing that that's always a pressure as well.
Yeah, Mike, from the industry standards and kind of, there's obviously a whole alphabet soup associated with imaging that people are used to. Do you see some emerging standards coming, some areas that are uncovered where there would be a benefit to developing some new standards? because interoperability, ultimately, you talked about kind of the bigs acquiring the littles, and now the bigs and the bigs, and right. But there's also the collaborative nature of, patient chooses to go get care in a different setting than where they've gone before, or they're traveling, and right. So how do we exchange information and pass it? What are you seeing, or from an industry standards point of view, what do you think might happen in the future here?
No, I think you're right. Look, data portability matters. So, I think we've talked about data platforms and its role in interoperability. We've talked about different standards environments and its role in sharing. And we also need to consider data portability when we start thinking about architectures that involve different geographical solutions like hybrid cloud, which is certainly a good one. I would argue that the standards are in place. They're going to continue to evolve, which is a positive thing, which isn't to say that they're wholly deficient. There's just an evolution of how data is being consumed. And I mentioned AI before as this new consumer that wants data very differently than clinicians have looked for their use of data, albeit from different clinical service lines. You look at what we're seeing in changes in multidisciplinary teams and tumor boards today, and how do we address that particular group of users. So I'm in the camp that I think that the standards that we need for interoperability need to be there. I think there needs to be, from the user community, a strong articulation that those standards need to be part of the core requirements for how these solutions get designed and deployed and supported, because once you start deviating from it, then you go to scale, and then it may work great in the beginning, and I think Dr. Kohli expressed that. Their first generation one just worked great until they started to scale, and then that's when it started to become insufficient.
And that comes back to the workflow design, Barinder, right? I think it's like where the rubber meets the road is how we're bringing people in and hearing from them and thinking about, I think you've talked, the group has talked about workflow design of kind of what the workflow looks like today, but then also looking for those efficiencies. But then there's the things that maybe haven't been anticipated yet until you talk a little bit more deeply with the users, right? Barinder, you want to talk about that?
I mean, even before workflow design, just understanding your current state is something people really underestimate. A lot of organizations think they understand their current state, and they really don't, because as I mentioned, there are a lot of workarounds and a lot of deviations from the established procedure that accumulate over the years, and people just kind of it's knowledge that isn't formalized, right? And so I always believe that one of the key elements to any sort of successful implementation of any new solution is that initial change management piece of finding the right clinical champions. And I've noticed that a lot of people conflate like suitability for this clinical champion role with seniority, and that's really, really not the case. Like, I think the most important thing for this clinical champion to have is really, really strong relationships within the department, but also across departments, but also an openness to different ways of working. So you don't have somebody who's just saying, this is the way I work, and I'm going to kind of like establish that as the baseline. They're really kind of interested in like how are things actually done, and then once you have that current state, that's where you can understand what's the impact of the change that you're implement, and also, what is my ideal state? Because in some cases, your ideal state, some of the elements of it might already be in place that you just don't know it yet.
I can give you an example of that in pathology, actually, and we've been seeing this happening. That if you were to ask a series of pathologists what their kind of data management requirements are, coming from an analog microscope-based workflow, they would say, once we sign out these cases, we keep them around for a few weeks, never look at them again. But when you peel that back and you ask why that is, it's because they get shipped off somewhere, and if I need them again, I put in a request and I may get them back in 2 or 3 days. So it doesn't become an effective way to use the workflow. As those same set of users have started to sign out cases digitally, we often hear that they're starting to change the way they're consuming historical data, because it's now available to them in a time and in a process that allows them to leverage, that data differently. So same users, arguably doing the same kind of work, now evolving their data access, their data management requirements to support more efficient way of working, maybe even, reducing some of the demands that they've had on consults and things, because they're able to increase their diagnostic confidence by having access to historical data that they before didn't easily have access to, so they weren't able to leverage it.
I just want to expand on that and with one thing, and that is, I think we've talked about the primary, we're focusing primarily on the primary use of the data, which is the use for the clinical interpretation process. But I think that with the digital availability, one of the things that becomes much more prevalent is our secondary use cases. So at UCSF, one of the things that we do is we say that if you want to use any of this data for research purposes, and we're already paying for the clinical system, and that research use is actually secondary to and it's incidental, meaning you've already got this infrastructure, you're paying for it, we don't charge our researchers for that. And I think that that sort of thing is going to be more important as we think about more and more of these digital workflows, and thinking about the secondary use of the data, either for research purposes. There is increasing interest because all of these massive AI companies are so well capitalized, there is actual dollar value to this data, which you can only get if you can actually extract the data in a meaningful way, and de-identify it in a meaningful way. So I think that one of the standards gaps right now is consistent, proven, trustworthy de-identification of medical image data in a robust way.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that this move, or expansion is probably a better way to frame it, from where we thought about data availability, and then we thought about search, and then we thought about analytics. Now we're really thinking about data orchestration, because we need now to have that data prepared in such a way that these additional use cases, whether they're secondary or just alternative primaries, in fact can be effectively utilized. The data has to be put together, made available in particular ways. Sometimes you hear about, well, it's got to be cleaned, and it's not so much that it's not cleaned, it just needs to be organized. We're talking about unstructured data, and so it's trying to bring some structure to an unstructured environment, and imaging and most healthcare data is largely unstructured. So what we're starting to see with orchestration now is becoming really important in organizations that are like Dell, who are spending a lot of time thinking about how we leverage the tools within infrastructure to provide more effective orchestration of data, so that search and analytics can be better leveraged on this rather large data set for a variety of purposes like you talked about.
And as you start to increase the different types of data in that data set, and it's constantly expanding, right? It's not something where you're going to come up with a strategy and I've done it, we're successful, and I can just park that. You're going to continue to have new types of imaging and new file formats, and some is DICOM and some is not DICOM, but to be able to orchestrate that data in a manner where the consumer doesn't need to care what type of data it is, that you can get the data to where it needs to be, the consumer can do what they need to do with the data. I mean, that's kind of where we need to drive to in order to achieve a lot of these goals.
So we'll invite you, if you have questions, if anyone would like to ask a question of any of the panelists, to come up to the microphones. We have one on each side. I'll start with the gentleman on this side.
Mark Neuberger with Neuberger Consulting, previously Apollo. One thing that you haven't talked about is how regulatory oversight, both from a clinical perspective and a governmental perspective, affects the need to orchestrate the data, store the data, access the data, and then combining that with the workflows. I'm curious as to how you all are dealing with it, both from a clinical perspective and a vendor perspective, to orchestrate, incorporating. I'm primarily focused on pathology, but all the other ologies, because radiology has a very specific workflow, regulatory oversight, both from a clinical and governmental perspective, that the other ologies have differently. Pathology specifically, you talk about the example of whether you need to go back and look at historical data, and pathologists say they don't, and that's because they don't have access to it. Digitally they will or do, but the requirement is they're supposed to, but they still don't. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure. So I think that there's there are a couple of different facets. I think that if I understand your question, I think the last assertion that you made about the requirement to compare to historical information, I would say isn't necessarily as much of a regulatory or as a clinical practice decision. And I think that you're absolutely right that a lot of doing the right thing for a patient has been limited by what is the thing that is reasonable and expedient to do, right? I mean, there's a lot of time that I could go and read every single patient chart before I read every single X-ray, right? So I think as a clinician, it's my judgment to understand when do I need to go and do a chart biopsy on this person versus when can I just read this case and sign it and move along. And I think that the availability of that data has changed that over time. And I think that what you're saying for pathology data is also going to change that. But pathology has a whole bunch of different regulations when it comes to things like CLIA and laboratory-derived testing and just a whole bunch of other ways that they create new ways of making diagnoses that and they do that at a very much more micro level on a single lab level than it takes us to deploy like a new MR or a new CT scanner. So I do think we'll need to have new ways of working and adapting to those workflows from more flexible, more configurable applications.
And from a vendor perspective, we definitely have to take that regulatory view of things from different lenses all the time, right? As we're getting into new ologies, we know that we can't just apply that to each ology and looking at what are the regulations. Does this change intended use? Is there work in that area? And not only kind of taking a look at it from that lens, but gaining enough expertise that we are the ones who are consulting and driving the customer in the right direction as well to ensure that we don't fall in any of those regulatory pitfalls.
That's great. Our next question.
Yeah, hi. Oh, good Lord, I can't have you zoom while I'm talking. So a little disappointing here about POCUS at all, under the other ologies, right? So I wanted you to see if you guys could discuss that for just a second. I'm going to give you some food for thought though. I noticed that Dr. Kohli and Andrew, when you guys were talking, sort of Andrew, I think from the lens of a vendor and you as a physician in radiology, speaking from somebody in the POCUS world, you had mentioned that there's this synonym problem, right? Accession number versus case ID, so you have to handle that. And maybe there's a different workflow to do that. And then you kind of brought up that, sometimes we shouldn't have all these bespoke workflows to handle all these different departments. It adds a lot of complexity. And then Mike said something I thought was interesting, was that we shouldn't have a common workflow. What we just need is a common platform, right? And I think with DICOM, I think we've solved a lot of that homonym and synonym problems that you were describing. Our VNAs and our enterprise imaging maybe just don't support it well. And just the last thought about that is Mach7, you guys represent Mach7. I can't tell you how many times customers will tell me, I can't send anything to Mach7 unless there's an order, because radiology told me there needs to be an order. Neither of those things are true, right? But people have that perception because of the technology they think they have. It's okay.
So if I could just respond to that, the first thing, I just want to make sure that what I am advocating for are clinically specific workflows, not trying to advocate for the lowest common denominator. And I will give you a fundamental example that we're grappling with today at UCSF in the point of care imaging space. So we have you could call it a POCUS PACS. The POCUS PACS accept images directly from all of our ultrasound devices. And, in radiology, the paradigm is that every single study that gets ordered is going to be signed and reported and billed. Okay, the paradigm that I've experienced in our point of care ultrasound world is that, even if they are ordering it, it may not actually be reported or billed, because a lot of times the people acquiring the images are trainees who are getting new experience, and they are maybe not paired with an attending who's going to be willing to finally interpret that, but they're actually still making clinical decisions on that information, even if somebody isn't willing to create a final report.
Still needs to be documented.
still needs to be documented because it's information that's being used for making a clinical decision. But it doesn't rise to the level of, we checked all the boxes for an abdomen limited and now we can bill for that. And so there's this thing in our pathology, in our point of care imaging packs, where they call everything an educational study. Okay, so this is the synonyms and homonyms, but they're not educational studies.
Right.
They're just non-billed studies. And so we have terminology problems in the workflows, and I think that's a critical, it's an example of what we're talking about today, because I want to persist that information on an encounter-based workflow, but everybody's like, well, it's just educational. Why do we need to save it?
Right. Yeah, and Brian, to your point, by not doing that, the revenue leakage that occurs by what could be billable studies are not getting billed, largely because the people who are executing the studies aren't putting value into that component. And so there is an element of departments and administrations to educate those same set of users to say, hey, POCUS is more than a digital stethoscope. It really is a diagnostic image, and it needs to be treated with the same respect and arguably chargeability as other diagnostic images.
Well, and sorry, briefly, Andrew, and also the same timeliness in reporting. So I lost my mind because I said, well, maybe you can have, 24 hours or 48 hours to complete this chart.
They want a week.
And to bill, they want a week.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what do you mean you want a week? If I didn't report something for a week, you guys would fire me. So it's very fascinating what the differences in the tolerance are for timeliness and documentation. And I have a lot of empathy for my emergency medicine colleagues. I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but the workflows are just very different.
Yeah, I do think POCUS is an excellent example of that. You can't take that radiology footprint and expand it to the enterprise, right? Like, you're not going to get an accession number for most of those types of images. And there's a lot of different stakeholders in POCUS, and what Barinder spoke about there's different success criteria for those different stakeholders. So some of those stakeholders just want to be able to perform the imaging. Some of those stakeholders want to be able to retain the imaging, and kind of having that kind of clinical resource who can champion and really collect everybody's success criteria and implement a reproducible system that lets you be successful there is really important, because there are technical solutions to that, right? But making sure that your success criteria isn't one stakeholder's success criteria, it's everybody's success criteria, I think a lot of the times is the challenging part in those workflows.
You guys have some great technical solutions. Your customers aren't leveraging them in a lot of cases. So it'd be nice to see that in the field.
Agreed.
That becomes a workflow issue, right? Sometimes they don't leverage them because it might be they don't understand they can, or it might be they don't have the right stakeholder engagement.
All right, any other questions out there? All right, we will go ahead. So you do have to add the session to your schedule to claim credit, and then you can see the instructions here on the screen about the code to use for the session and the RT code as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and thank our panelists for their time. So thank you, Dr. Kohli, Mike Valante.
I'd like to give out one more shout out. This afternoon,
Yes.
there is a presentation very specifically on digital pathology and how that's being leveraged, which might be of interest to you. The speakers are from, there's several of the really key opinion leaders in digital transformation pathology from the Computational Pathology Center of Excellence and part of PIT and UPMC. So I would invite all of you. It's later this afternoon. To check the schedule. I want to say it's 4:30, but I could be off. 5. So a shout out to those folks. They're a fabulous group and worth hearing that to dive a little deeper into the digital pathology space.
All right, thank you everyone for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.